You find yourself stepping back. The gatherings that once felt normal now feel empty. Conversations repeat the same rehearsed ideas, and the effort required to pretend interest no longer feels worth it. You've spent years performing, smiling when you felt nothing, agreeing even when you could see through every word, and giving your time and patience to people who never truly asked how you were doing. Now something has changed. The guilt of distancing yourself is still present, but it is quieter than the exhaustion of staying. Society has a name for this. They may call you antisocial or say you are isolating yourself. They might even assume something is wrong with you simply because you no longer want to take part in a game you've already understood. But they are not diagnosing a problem. They are misreading a transition. Carl Jung spent years studying what happens when a mind begins to separate from the collective. He did not see it as dysfunction. He called it individuation. It is one of the most important psychological processes a person can go through. You are not withdrawing from life itself. You are stepping away from what was never truly real. And that difference changes everything. That single insight breaks apart the idea you were taught about connection. You were told that being around others is the solution to loneliness. That if you put yourself out there, tried harder, smiled more, and said yes more often, the emptiness would disappear. But it never did. Because that emptiness was never caused by a lack of people. It came from a lack of depth. You have been surrounded by people your entire life, yet still felt completely alone, because the version of you showing up in those moments was never fully you. It was the version shaped and trained by expectations, and what you are feeling now is not introversion or social anxiety. It is the pressure of carrying a role you have already outgrown. Deep psychology reveals a pattern that most people will never fully understand. Because most people never reach the level of awareness where it becomes active. The more conscious you become, the less tolerable superficiality starts to feel. The more clearly you observe human behavior for what it is, the less energy you have for pretending that you don't see it. As a result, the world may label you as difficult, withdrawn, or cold, when in reality you are simply more aware. What you are going to understand through this video is the key principle that separates those who struggle under awareness from those who turn it into inner control. This is what can be called the structure of strategic distance. Once you see it clearly, you no longer feel guilty for choosing yourself over constant noise. If these ideas connect with you, you can subscribe for more high-quality content. You can also comment strategic distance, so it's clear you are following along. Let's begin. There is a concept in Jungian psychology that, once understood, permanently changes how you view social interaction. Carl Jung referred to it as the persona, or the mask. This is not just a metaphor, but a real psychological structure that every human develops from childhood in order to adapt to social expectations. You also developed one. You learned which version of yourself received approval. You learned which emotions were acceptable and which ones needed to be hidden. You understood that agreeableness was rewarded, while conflict was often discouraged. Over time, you learned that the safest way to exist in a group was to become what the group expected you to be, and you likely became very good at it. That is where the issue begins, because the more effectively you performed this role, the more the real self started to disappear, not in the eyes of others, but in your own awareness. The persona does not only operate outwardly. Over time, it becomes fused with identity itself. You gradually lose clarity about where the performance ends and where your real self begins. So, when you began distancing yourself from social environments, it was not because you suddenly became antisocial. It was because the mask started to break down. You started noticing the tension between who you were acting as and who you actually are. That tension is not a sign of dysfunction. It is often the first indication of psychological awareness. Consider this carefully. Most of the social exhaustion you have experienced was never truly caused by people themselves. It was caused by performance. The effort required to maintain a persona in settings that demand constant positivity, continuous agreeableness, and repeated smiling compliance is extremely high. And for years, you have been paying that cost without even questioning it. You may have believed this fatigue was a personal flaw. You may have assumed it meant you were not suited for social life. In reality, it often indicates that you are no longer willing to sustain pretending. These are fundamentally different conditions. The persona once served a purpose. It provided protection at a time when honesty may not have been safe. It allowed access to social groups, acceptance, and a form of belonging that felt sufficient before deeper awareness developed. However, with time, you begin to recognize that many social environments consist of people wearing similar masks. What is often called connection is, in many cases, coordinated performance rather than genuine presence. Carl Jung cautioned that the real danger of the persona is not its existence, but the failure to recognize it as a mask. Most individuals never remove it because they lack the self-awareness to see that it is there in the first place. You, however, have noticed it, and once that recognition occurs, a lasting shift begins. Environments that once felt normal may start to feel restrictive. Conversations that once seemed acceptable may begin to feel empty. Relationships that once felt sufficient may now appear like unspoken agreements you never consciously made. This is not a collapse. It is the formation of a boundary. Your psychological system is beginning to distinguish between what depletes you and what actually supports you. If you observe carefully, you may notice that what drains you most are the situations that require you to reduce your depth in order to fit in. However, removing the mask is only the initial stage. What comes next determines whether your awareness becomes liberation or turns into a form of psychological confinement. There is a mental burden that is rarely discussed, mainly because those who experience it often have no clear way to explain it. This is the burden of pattern recognition. You do not see more because you are superior, but because you are more observant. You notice when someone's words do not align with their energy. You detect subtle changes in tone when a person feels uncertain or threatened. You pick up on quiet shifts in conversations where someone tries to gain advantage while presenting it as friendliness. In every space you enter, you begin to perceive an invisible structure. Who is posturing? Who is pretending? Who is being drained? And who is draining others? The weight of this awareness is something people around you will not fully understand, because they remain inside the performance itself. In psychological terms, this is often referred to as the cost of awareness. Once human behavior becomes clear to you, it cannot be unseen. You cannot return to the earlier state of comfortable ignorance that once made superficial interactions easier to tolerate. Every networking environment begins to resemble a stage of competing identities. Even simple conversations turn into processes of interpreting what is being communicated beneath the surface. Relationships begin to feel like ongoing negotiations between authenticity and performance. The exhaustion you feel is not a sign of weakness, but the result of processing multiple layers of social reality that most people do not consciously perceive. Carl Jung described related ideas through shadow work and individuation. As an individual integrates more unconscious aspects of the self and begins to face what was previously denied, they also develop a more refined ability to recognize unconscious patterns in others. The deeper the self-understanding becomes, the clearer external behavior appears as well. However, clarity in a world built on comfortable illusions can create isolation. But this awareness also carries a potential risk. A highly perceptive mind that consistently sees performance in others may gradually develop a quiet form of contempt, not anger, but a colder sense of disillusionment. If left unexamined, this disillusionment can turn into bitterness. Over time, you may begin to assume that depth is not possible, that authenticity no longer exists, and that no one is capable of meeting you at your level of understanding. And if this belief is allowed to settle, it does not protect you. It confines you. Strategic distance is not cynicism, and it is not withdrawal driven by resentment. It is the disciplined and conscious choice to direct your energy only toward what actually respects and values it. The difference between these two states reflects the gap between someone who has integrated awareness and someone who is being overwhelmed by it. Carl Jung was clear on this point. The aim of recognizing the shadow, both within yourself and in others, is not judgment, it is integration. It is about holding a complete understanding of human nature without being psychologically harmed by it. A mind that becomes aware but withdraws in bitterness has not completed the process. It has stopped midway. And stopping at that stage can be more harmful than never starting at all, because you end up with enough insight to isolate yourself, but not enough maturity to find peace within that isolation. So the real question is not whether your awareness is justified. The question is what you are choosing to construct with it. This is where real transformation takes place. Not in simply observing and not in withdrawal alone, but in how you reframe the experience. Everything you have gone through up to this point, the exhaustion, the disappointment, and the gradual distancing from a world that felt increasingly empty, can be understood as preparation, not for isolation, but for sovereignty. Inner sovereignty is a psychological condition where your sense of self no longer depends on external validation, social approval, or the constant performance of connection. It reflects what Jung described as the outcome of individuation. It is a state in which the mind has integrated its shadow, moved beyond its persona, and developed a stable relationship with itself that does not require external confirmation of worth. You were previously taught that belonging is the highest human need. That idea that connection is the cure, and that if you feel alone, you simply need to fix yourself until you fit back into society, is deeply ingrained in most people. However, Carl Jung's framework suggests the opposite. He argued that the process of individuation naturally includes a phase of separation from the collective. This is not meant to be permanent isolation, but rather a deliberate and strategic distance from group thinking, allowing you to reconnect with your own inner voice. Now consider what that actually means for you. Every moment of guilt you have felt for avoiding social gatherings, for stepping back from small talk, or for distancing yourself from relationships that take more than they give. That guilt was not originally yours. It was shaped and installed by a social system that relies on your continued participation. This system does not function well when individuals become self-sufficient. It benefits when people remain dependent, when they feel lonely enough to seek connection even in draining environments, or insecure enough to keep performing versions of themselves that serve others more than themselves. Strategic distance is the refusal to engage in that exchange. It is not avoidance. It is one of the most refined forms of psychological boundary setting. It reflects a clear internal stance. I will not spend my energy maintaining connections that do not support my growth. I will not perform agreement to avoid disappointing others, and I will not sacrifice depth for the sake of superficial harmony. When this shift happens, something important changes. The guilt begins to fade, not because selfishness has been justified, but because you realize what you once called selfishness was actually self-preservation. An aware mind is not obligated to distribute its energy to everyone who demands it. A sovereign mind manages its energy with the same precision a strategist uses when allocating resources. It invests where there is meaningful return, it protects areas of vulnerability, and it withdraws from dynamics that consistently take more than they give. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. This is close to what Carl Jung described as the individuated self. It is not a person who has rejected humanity, but someone who no longer confuses closeness with connection, performance with presence, or compliance with love. A sovereign mind still forms connections, but it does so on its own terms, from a place of internal wholeness rather than emotional need. And that kind of connection carries far more value than countless empty interactions where both people are simply wearing masks and mistaking that distance for intimacy. Understanding psychology is important, but it has little value if it cannot be applied. That is why we build a practical framework. Strategic distance is based on three core principles that, once fully understood, become the foundation of inner sovereignty and emotional regulation. The first principle is energy auditing. From this point forward, you treat your emotional and mental energy as a limited resource, not an endless supply that can be freely given to every interaction, obligation, or social demand placed on you. You begin to audit your life. You evaluate every recurring relationship, every social responsibility, and every habitual interaction by asking a simple question. Does this leave me more whole or more depleted? Not whether it feels pleasant, and not whether the other person is kind, but whether the exchange provides genuine depth, or whether you are continuously supporting a dynamic that depends on your agreeableness. Relationships that drain you are not always toxic. They may be completely fine for someone else, but not suitable for you. Recognizing this is not an act of cruelty. It is one of the most honest forms of self-mastery. The second principle is selective engagement. This is where strategic distance becomes practical. You stop automatically saying yes. For years you may have accepted invitations, obligations, and social expectations out of guilt or a conditioned fear that saying no makes you a bad person. That conditioning benefited others more than it benefited you. From this point onward, your presence becomes intentional. You engage in situations that genuinely nourish you. You connect with people who can meet your level of depth. Everything else is declined, without the need for justification. The discomfort that may arise during this shift, the subtle guilt or internal voice suggesting you are being selfish, is simply the remaining trace of an older persona attempting to regain control. You will notice it, but you will not follow it. A sovereign mind does not make decisions based on the emotional expectations of others. It makes decisions based on alignment between its actions and its real internal needs. The third principle is the one most people resist, and it is also the one that determines whether your distance becomes a fortress or turns into a cage. This is shadow integration of the hermit archetype. Here is the uncomfortable reality. Part of your withdrawal is healthy. It reflects awareness, self-protection, and the psyche establishing boundaries that should have existed much earlier. However, there is also another layer, a shadow aspect, that withdraws for less healthy reasons. It comes from a wounded internal place that decided long ago that the world is unsafe, that people cannot be fully trusted, and that vulnerability is a mistake. This part does not seek distance for growth, but for avoidance. Carl Jung was clear that every archetype contains a shadow. The shadow side of the hermit is not wisdom. It is fear disguised as superiority. It is the part of the psyche that uses awareness as a barrier, not because protection is needed in the moment, but because true openness with the right people feels more threatening than isolation. Integrating this shadow does not mean removing your boundaries. It means examining them with honesty. It requires asking, in each moment of withdrawal, whether the choice is driven by growth or by fear of emotional cost. Strategic distance is a deliberate and conscious decision based on clarity. Avoidance, in contrast, is an automatic reaction shaped by unresolved emotional pain. The distinction between them determines whether solitude becomes a position of inner strength or a place of hiding. In Jung's description of individuation, there is a critical threshold. It is the stage where the mind no longer moves back and forth between its old identity and its developing self. It stops seeking permission. It stops comparing itself to the collective. It stops measuring worth using social standards. Instead, it simply becomes what it truly is. Most individuals never reach this threshold. Not due to lack of ability, but because crossing it requires something modern society rarely supports: the willingness to be misunderstood. It requires accepting that even close people may not understand why you have changed, why you have become quieter, or why you no longer participate in the same way as before. You have to hold your own truth in one hand and other people's confusion in the other, and continue moving forward without feeling the need to reconcile the two. Deep psychology explains that the individuated mind does not aim to be understood by everyone. It focuses on fully understanding itself. In that state of self-grounded awareness, a different form of peace emerges, not the peace of belonging or constant companionship, but the peace of alignment. This is the state where your inner identity and your external behavior are no longer in conflict. The mask disappears, not because it was forcibly removed, but because it has naturally become outdated. Your silence is no longer emptiness, it becomes fullness. Your solitude is no longer absence, it becomes presence. This is what inner sovereignty truly represents. It is not loud, not performative, and not a carefully constructed identity of detachment. It is quiet and stable. It is the calm certainty of a mind that has completed the necessary inner work and no longer requires external validation to confirm the validity of its truth. Strategic distance exists to protect this process. Not your comfort, not your pride, but your psychological development. It safeguards the journey toward wholeness in a world that often benefits from keeping people fragmented. Every superficial interaction you chose not to engage in, every draining relationship you stepped away from, and every social expectation you declined to fulfill were not acts of rejection. They were acts of conscious selection. You were shaping the environment required for your individuation. Once you understand this, guilt loses its importance. Loneliness also begins to shift, because it was never true isolation. You were surrounded by people who simply could not truly perceive you. Now that self-perception has developed, the external environment holds far less weight. You have likely carried a question for a long time. A question you hesitated to express because you were conditioned to believe that its answer would suggest something is fundamentally wrong with you. The question is this: is it actually okay that you no longer want to play the game? The answer, one that Carl Jung spent his life exploring, and one that deep psychology clearly points toward when studied honestly, is yes. Not only is it okay, it is often the essential requirement for everything you have been searching for. The peace you once believed would come from finding the right people, the right environment, or the right circumstances does not actually originate outside of you. It appears at the moment you stop abandoning yourself in order to gain a sense of belonging that was never meant to be found in those environments to begin with. Your strategic distance is not a weakness. It is your foundation. It is the boundary that preserves your development. It is the silence that allows you to hear the only guidance that has always mattered, your own. So here is what you are invited to do. If you recognize yourself in this message, and you feel that internal shift where something finally feels settled, go to the comments and write, "I choose sovereignty, not for anyone else, but for yourself." Psychological declarations carry real weight, and when you consciously define your distance as a choice, you begin to reshape the internal narrative you have been carrying. It no longer feels like something is wrong with you. It starts to feel like something is finally right about you. And if you are ready to go deeper, if you understand that this is not just a single video, but the beginning of a completely different way of interpreting yourself and the world, then subscribe. This space is dedicated to exploring deep psychology, shadow work, and self-mastery, not as theory, but as the structure of a stable, unshakable life. Each video here is designed to give you the kind of clarity that is rarely offered openly. And whatever you do not stop here. The next video on screen continues directly from this point. It applies the idea of strategic distance to one of the most important human dynamics, something most people never fully understand. You do not want to miss it. See what others overlook. Understand what others avoid. Become who others do not become.